Lunch, yes. It comes as no surprise for those of you who know me that my interest was more in the math science realm, which would lead me to having, as most of you probably would, a least favorite subject. And that subject for me would be something like history. Now, which is surprising because history is just one big story. And you'd think that we would love just to know a story and it'd be easy to recount a story and tell a story. And for those of you, I just want to know, any history lovers out there? Great. I'm not saying like as much as I don't know that I'm great at history. It doesn't mean I don't have a respect for history. It just wasn't the one I was naturally gravitating to and able to do as well. But this morning, the reason I tell you that a little bit is because I am going to try as a math person to teach a little bit of history today, which is a little bit like history people who don't love math trying to teach a little bit of math today. And so just bear with me. So those of you who are history lovers, and you get this inside out, upwards, backwards, everything, and you're just going to look at me and hear some of the things I say and go, that wasn't quite right. I'm doing my best this morning to try and simplify as a math person would for other people who don't naturally gravitate toward history to understand history, okay? And more importantly, to understand the Bible. The second thing I want to tell you is I've started working out because it's important. And thank you. Very nice. For all of you at home, why I'm telling you that, I have no idea. But the point is, the reason I'm telling you that is because even in the short time I've started working out, none of you probably came here this morning and said, he's working out, okay? So, however, it's a little bit like if I asked you right now what your spiritual strength is or your biblical knowledge is on a scale of 0 for some to 10, how strong would you feel? On that scale, I would not be on, ding, 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 this side of super strength, Arnold Schwarzenegger, or any other great super buff guy that you've ever known or women that you've ever known in your life, okay? It's not me yet, and I don't ever actually anticipate it to be me. But I can tell you this, after a month, I'm healthier than I was a month ago, okay? So I'm better off than I was a month ago, and I hope that that will slowly continue to build and build, and that I'll be stronger every day. I'm not looking to be a Hulk. I'm looking to be stronger. And this year, our words are strength and rebuild. And when we come together, our hope is that in some way we're becoming spiritually stronger, okay? And this year, my heart is that I will become spiritually stronger and that you will become spiritually stronger. And part of that is understanding this morning a little bit of history, understanding a little bit of how the Bible is put together and how it actually is going to play into a story that we're going to be speaking about for the next several weeks in the book of Nehemiah. And the reason this story is important is if you don't know the story of Nehemiah, I'm going to cut a little bit to the chase and say this was probably one of the darkest times in Israel's history. I'm not even talking about today. I'm talking about years and years ago when Nehemiah was written. This was a time when Israel, the people, chosen people of God, had highs and lows. They were on the ultimate high when God received them and brought them together and saved them. And there are lots of things I'll highlight this morning. But I want to tell you the story of Nehemiah catches us when there is a people at an ultimate low point. And maybe you feel at sometimes an ultimate low point that there's no hope. There's nothing you can do. There's no way to move forward. There's nothing I can do to take that next step. Well, I want to tell you, even just as I have taken one small step every single day to try and get a little bit stronger, you can start today to get a little bit stronger and point yourself toward being more like the person that we've been talking about, the characteristics of the people we've been talking about, like Noah and Daniel. And now we're going to hear about Nehemiah, to be righteous and blameless and faithful. Righteous and blameless and faithful. We want to become this year more righteous. I want to become more like Christ. I want to become more blameless. I don't want people to look at me and say, oh, do you know what? I have a story to tell about them that as much as they're up here on this platform, there's actually, I could say something that would just cut the knees out from under them and take them out. I don't want people to have those stories about me this year. There may be stories in my past, but I don't want any story to come up this year, this moment moving forward, that someone could take the knees out from under me and say, oh, this guy, he's blameful. Nor do I want to be a person who blames others, all right? And same thing with being faithful. Just how is it I can be more faithful to the God that I love and serve? How can I do that this year with attention and intention? So today I want to take you on a little bit of a survey of the Old Testament. And I don't do this to bore you. I actually want to do this to teach you and teach you from a very general perspective so that you can get a grasp on the story. And we're just going to hit the story today, Nehemiah, just the first chapter. We're just going to maybe into chapter 2, depends on how much time we have, but we're going to see just a little bit of Nehemiah's story and understand that Nehemiah was a person who was righteous, blameless, and faithful, who at a time, a very low time, a very difficult time, in a time when people saw no hope, he declared that there is hope. And he pointed the way toward the one who we know is hope, and that's Jesus. We want to see how the King of the New Testament is declared and pointed toward in the Old Testament, that the God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New Testament, and there is hope for all of us when we receive the gift that he has for us. So I'm going to take you back, and I'm going to take you to 3 particular people in the Old Testament. One, his name is Abraham. Another, his name is Moses. And another, his name is David. How many of you have heard those names before? Okay, even if you've never been to church, you've probably heard those names before, okay? And I want you to think about timelines. Now, again, this isn't perfect, but this is a math student trying to teach a history person, or regular person about history, so the numbers have to be somewhat general, okay? So get this. So I want you to take 2,000 years before Christ, or let's say 4,000 years ago, we have this guy, his name is Abraham. About 3,500 years ago, or 1,500 years ago before Christ, we have this guy, his name is Moses. And about 3,000 years ago, or about 1,000 years before Jesus, we have this guy named David. Okay? So we have 500-year increments. We have Abraham, we have Moses, we have David. Okay? We're good so far? Abraham, each of these men were given a covenant by God. There's what we call the Abrahamic covenant. I'm saying that probably a little bit wrong syllable-wise. A Mosaic covenant, and there's a Davidic covenant. Now, covenants can be either conditional or unconditional. Conditional or unconditional. So the Abrahamic covenant was unconditional. He gave him a covenant, and that covenant was that Abraham would be the head and the start of a great nation, that they would be receivers of an increase of land, that they would be given a promised land, that there would be a population increase, that the sands of that people group, this Israelite people group, would be so vast, it would be like the sand of the seashore, and all peoples would be blessed through Abraham. So we know the story of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of a man named Jacob. And through wrestling with God, Jacob was given a new name. Does anyone know what it was? Israel, of which the Israelite nation emerged. He had 12 sons. And the 12 sons, one of which was Joseph, the 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. Sold off to a place called what? Egypt. And in Egypt, he was in jail for a time. So his 11 brothers got rid of the younger brother because his younger brother was loved most by their father, Israel. He goes off, he's enslaved, but by God's own grace and by David's righteousness, blamelessness, and faithfulness, he rises to become second in command in all of Egypt. He then saves his own family from slavery, from the famine, from being persecuted. How ironic that he was the one cast away so that they could thrive, and they were the ones who fell, and he was the one who thrived, and he saved their life. And he brought them to Egypt to have food, to have prosperity, protection, a place to live, and not having to live in fear anymore. This was great. It was a high point for the Israelite nation. However, several years pass, and they become enslaved by the Egyptians. They actually become so enslaved that it is persecution of these people. They are enslaved to the Egyptian nation. It's at that point that there needed to be a plan. It was either we are going to bottom out and we're just going to give up all hope, or we're going to find a Savior. Moses, 500 years later, we're now in Moses. And God gave a promise. There was a covenant with Moses, but Moses was the one who was called to then save the Israelite nation out of this slavery in Egypt. And he was chosen. Just came to me. It was between God and the nation of Israel. And so Exodus 19 through 24, it identifies that there is this law agreement that is to take place. There's this obeying of the law. There's this importance to be set apart. Does anyone remember Mount Sinai? Okay, so when Moses goes before Pharaoh, he calls to let all of his people go, all of the Israelite people to go. And you may know the story of the 10 plagues. It took 10 plagues, the last plague being the death of a firstborn son. Guess who had a firstborn son? Pharaoh himself. And so at that, there was a release of the Israelite nation. This is when they go and they are released, but then a problem emerges. Pharaoh just changes his mind, and the Israelites are followed by the Egyptian army, and the other problem is they're up against a wall. It's called a wall of water. It's called the Red Sea, and looks like there's no way out, but God provides a way out. The faith of Moses, the faith of that leadership, the faith of a people then divides and makes a way where there is no way. They were at the bottom, but their faith was increased. They come through, the Egyptians are thwarted, and now they are on their way to the promised land. They're able to see that there is something ahead of them that is within grasp. In fact, it is so in grasp that they could have had it almost immediately, and yet their faith was at a low point, and they had to walk in the wilderness for 40 years. Only 2 people from that group made it into the promised land. Does anyone remember who those 2 people were? Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb. Did you notice I didn't say Moses? Moses, even at the end of his life, even through all the highs of his life, he said, you know what? He did something that displeased God, and he wasn't allowed to enter. But that promise was fulfilled. So it was that now this promise that if you obey me, if you come and you follow me, and there are details about all the blessings that would be received if you follow me and make me your one true God. If you look at Deuteronomy 28, there's a detail of these. It says, be light in a dark world so that people would know that they worship Yahweh. He was calling these Israelite people, this Israelite nation, to walk forward and to say, yes, we are for you. We are walking faith for you. We are the light of the world for you, so that people would see you in us. This agreement made with Moses was referred to as the Old Covenant. It was a Mosaic law. And when we think about the Old Covenant, that's what the Old Testament is. The Old Covenant, the Old Testament, that's really what those 2 names mean. They're similar. That when we read the Old Testament, we're reading the story of the Old Covenant, the old agreement between God and his people. And of course, the New Covenant is the New Testament. It's the new agreement between, even as we celebrated with communion this morning, the New Testament is an agreement between us and God now through the person of Christ. So now we're exploring this Old Testament story of where in the Shema it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And let the commandments be on your heart day and night. They said, write it on your forehead, do it on your posts, tell your children, fear God, serve him only, for he is a jealous God. And there are consequences when you don't follow my instruction. This is really important, that there is blessing and there is curse. There is consequence to your actions when you go outside of my purview of instruction. So I want you to do what is right so that it may go well with you and that you may go in and take possession over the good land God has promised, thrusting out all your enemies before you. If we are careful to obey all this law before God as he has commanded us, that will be our righteousness. And this was the instruction for years. It was, if you follow me, it will go well with you. I will be your God. I will stand with you. You will be protected from your enemies. They will be thwarted. This is not hard. And yet it seems to be the most difficult thing for the Israelites to carry out. They may know it in their minds, but it doesn't play out from their heart overflowing into what they do and say. And so there's a ripple effect of highs and lows over the next 500 years of where they have different ideas of who is going to be in control and how they're going to live their lives. There are times of prosperity and there are times of weakness. They go through a period where they're looking for leaders. They're looking for people in their society to help them and instruct them in what they are to do. They just don't have all the answers, and so they instill judges. You heard the book of Judges in the Bible. We hear of different judges. And over time, highs and lows, there came a point where they looked around them and they said, you know what? The nations that are thriving, which we don't seem to be all the time, they have a king. You know what? I think we should have a king. And here comes the story of the kings. So we've made our way from the Abrahamic covenant 2,000 years before Christ. We're 1,500 years before Christ. We are now at the Mosaic covenant. Now we are going to enter a time of the Davidic covenant, 1,000 years before Christ. But before David, there was another king. Who was the first king of Israel? King Saul. Now, King Saul looked like a king. He just had the structure of a king, but he wasn't a great king. In fact, it was during that time, you probably know the story of David and Goliath. That was King Saul's era. And David was taunting the Israelite armies. And he's saying, you send your best to come and fight me. And if I defeat you, you are ours. And if, I can't even imagine, you defeat me, then we will be yours. Let's have it. And he's taunting and taunting and taunting and taunting day after day after day after day. And no one wants to stand up against David. And King Saul is Goliath. And no one wants to stand up against this foe or enemy. Until David comes along. David's this shepherd boy. David is the brother of all those older guys who are out in the army that are sitting there wondering, what should we do next? And he just says, will you just let me do this? I know God is with me. He's calling me to this position at this time, and I believe that I am to stand in front of this enemy. At the time when it was lowest, he saw God's highest. And so he stands, and of course you know the story. He defeats the enemy, Goliath. And as popular as King Saul may have been for leading a victory, it says, if there were 1,000 that were praising King Saul, 10,000 were praising David. Well, King Saul was a jealous king. And so King Saul, whose son Jonathan was the best friend of David to this point, he actually went to try and have David killed. David was able to maneuver his way around that. Ultimately, King Saul was killed, and David was anointed king. And I want you to think that this is around the time of 1000 BC. And there was a Davidic covenant, and it was an unconditional covenant. So the first covenant was unconditional with Abraham. That I'm going to bless you. No matter what you do, I'm coming through. And here it is with Moses, though, but the structure of how it happens is completely up to you. You follow me, it's going to go well. If you don't follow me, you're going to suffer. But I am still carrying out this promise. And now he's up to David. And David, he says to David, I have a promise with you, and it's unconditional. That my line is going to continue through you. God promises David and Israel that the Messiah, Jesus Christ, he doesn't actually identify his name, but this Messiah, who would be Jesus, would come from the lineage of David and the tribe of Judah. Remember, there are 12 tribes. One of those is Judah, and he would establish a kingdom that would endure forever. In the first the first book of the New Testament, Matthew, it says in verse 9 of 21, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. When was that shared? Do you remember when that was? When Jesus was coming into Jerusalem. And they thought he was a certain kind of king, but he was a different kind of king. He was a servant king. And he was going to change the world. It was just, in fact, that happening as it was said it would. Jesus was from the line of David, and he became king. So this was a Davidic covenant that was made with David. Okay, now it's where we get a little more specific. So David, now the reason that we want to link these stories together is that because Nehemiah's story is centered on the rebuilding of the temple. The temple walls. The rebuilding of the temple walls. The city walls of Jerusalem. But in the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, remember I'm a math guy. In the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, we hear this. There are three things that are going to be rebuilt after a siege takes place. It's going to be an altar, a temple, and walls. Let's build our way up to that because the temple isn't even built yet. Does David build the temple? No, he probably would have liked to. It was actually his son Solomon that ended up building the temple. His son Solomon. And it was his instruction, Solomon's instruction, when he became king in 970 BC. He was the one who was made king, and in 960 BC, the temple, this elaborate, lavish, beautiful temple, which makes sense because Solomon was a rich king. He had resources like you couldn't even believe. And he had the appreciation of the people, and he was known as the wisest person who ever lived. At the beginning of his life, he was righteous and blameless and faithful, and he was moving forward in the ways of God. And this temple was built. It was built, and there was a Holy Spirit presence in this temple that just couldn't be denied. It was just God's presence all over this building. You knew that there was something that had been created here that was for the glory of God. Israel was on its way up. Until not long after that, Solomon's life took a turn. And it was in that turn that he started following worldly ways. He started taking on wives who worship foreign gods. He was easily swayed in a way that he had never been before. And now the people were looking for a new king, a new leader. There was a son of his. His name was Rehoboam. Don't try to spell it. Rehoboam. And Rehoboam was a son, and there was another man named Jeroboam who was an official to Solomon. Okay, they weren't brothers, they weren't twins. Rehoboam and Jeroboam were just two names. They just sound similar, but they are two very different people. And there was a prophetic word given to Jeroboam that the nation of Israel would be divided, that there would be this division. This had never happened before. In all of the years that the Israelites had been together, there had never been a division like this. But it was going to take place. And it was said in this prophetic word that Jeroboam would lead 10 of those tribes. And there would be 2 that would remain under the care and structure of Rehoboam. Rehoboam he heard word of this, he tried to rebel and tried to work against getting Jeroboam killed. It didn't work, and it did happen just as it was prophesied. The 12 tribes made their way into 2 spaces, one into the north and one in the south. Jerusalem was in the south. Now remember, this is the place where the temple of Solomon was built. This is Jerusalem. This is the hub and center of the Davidic kingdom. This is the place where people worship the one true God. And now there was this division. 10 of those tribes go north. There were 2 tribes that stayed south. These tribes, referred to as the northern kingdom, were overseen by this person named Jeroboam. And this person, who was a righteous man, this person in the bottom, the son, Rehoboam, was in the south, and there were 2 tribes down here. Does anyone, this is testing all you history or biblical people, does anyone remember any of the 2 names of these tribes right here? Benjamin and Judah. Has anyone heard of the name the Lion of Judah? Referring to who? Jesus. That's because he was a descendant of Judah. He was the lion. He was the fierce. There's no one above him. This is him. He is from Judah. And so we have these 2 tribes working. There's a division. Now there's a problem, a major problem, 2 actually. One in the south is that they're being led by an evil, very hurtful king. In the north, it started well, but they were separated from their space of worship. So what happened in the north is Jeroboam then said, well, we can't travel to Jerusalem. It's just cumbersome. It's too far. It's just not practical. So we're going to set up some places of worship here. And what happened very quickly was that those places of worship became places of worship to not only the one true God, but to foreign gods. And then soon, the people of Israel then intermarried with the people of the northern kingdom, Sumerians, people from other nations, and they became intermixed. Intermixed not only in race, but intermixed in terms of relationship with God. And what happened was their worship became pagan in many cases. Not everyone, but certainly many. And in 722 BC, and think of this as not ABC, but ABP. There are 3 groups I'm going to talk about. The Assyrians, A, the Babylonians, B, and the Persians, P. The Assyrians came in and decimated the area. took all those people and cast them out of that northern kingdom. 722. They weren't following God. And God had made it known what would happen when you don't follow me. There are consequences. 722 BC, the Assyrians come in, and the people are dispersed to basically never be known of again. But thankfully, we still have the southern kingdom. We still have Judah, and it's going to live intact, right? Because that's the promise. We're going to live here, and there's not going to be any issue, even if we have a king that's evil or really difficult to live with. You see, this was a vassal state. There was this, Babylonian pressure, and there was this structural pressure. They weren't the greatest nation, but they wanted to still exist. They wanted to live. And so what was happening was these people were living in their area, and then they became overwhelmed. They weren't defeated yet, but they were now a vassal state where they could do what they wanted internally, but their decisions externally, their foreign affairs, were taken care of by other people, a grand nation. And so the Babylonians, who were in power at that time under the king Nebuchadnezzar, they come and they tried to be civil, but then the people of Judah thought they would pull a fast one, work with other people in the areas that didn't like the Babylonians, and they thought they could stand up against their oversight, and it didn't go well. It actually went really bad. And the Babylonians came in and they crushed the people of Judah. So much so that they crushed their spirits. They took them captive back to Babylonia. I should go this way on a map. They're going west to like Iraq. They took them about 1,300 kilometers away, which is like the distance from here to Montreal. They distanced them from their homeland. Then they destroyed their altars. They destroyed their temple. They destroyed their walls. All that they left in that nation in 586 BC was just this remnant. People, the poorest of the poor, who could just take care of whatever they wanted to in that area, maybe a little bit of land keeping, maybe some work in the vineyards, but they took the first fruits of that nation. We're talking hundreds of thousands, even millions of people displaced to a new nation. It was devastating. So here you have Judah overtaken by the Babylonians, and you think of Nebuchadnezzar. Even before this, some people were taken out. Do you remember the story of Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego? That was the same Nebuchadnezzar that took those guys out earlier. He took the finest and the best, and he took them to his nation so that they would glean from their strength, wisdom, and they tried to transform them, right? They tried to transform them physically with what they ate, with what they thought, with how they lived. They wanted to just eliminate any of this understanding that they had of their past, their Israelite past. So these stories of Daniel, if you look in the Bible and you look at this book of Daniel, you'll see there that, that's a book, but chronologically, where does it lie? Well, that's where that takes place. So the people are displaced, but thankfully, I guess, the Babylonians, remember we said Assyrians, Babylonians, and, does anyone remember? Persians. The Persians then overtook the Babylonians. And in the first year of his reign, this king called Cyrus, he comes along, and for who knows what, other than it's only God. It's only God. God presses on Cyrus's heart and says, I believe now in 538 BC, like 50 years later, that I need to send people back to rebuild Jerusalem. Just imagine that for a minute, that God works in the heart of someone you would never imagine, and what seems to be an opponent, and he allows this new work to take place. And he sends back a leader by the name of Zerubbabel. That's a tongue twister. Zerubbabel was a governor, or given the position of a governor, to oversee Jerusalem and the rebuilding and return to rebuild this temple. Now remember, the temple of Solomon destroyed, and now Zerubbabel comes, and his piece is to bring like 50,000 people and all their wares, and they go back to rebuild this temple. That's how important it is. Cyrus knows that for whatever way it worked for the kingdom, for the Persian Empire, this worked. And he said, under God, I'm calling you to go back and rebuild. That's a word of our year. So at the lowest point, in captivity, God does a miracle, and he allows the miracle to start with the rebuilding of the altar first, a place of giving sacrifice, and then the place of worship, the temple. So Zerubbabel goes back. It starts the work. There's opposition. There's lots of it's a strange story because the opposition is Zerubbabel comes back, and there's immediate opposition. Why? Because there's an invasion of space. There are actually people living in Judah. And now Zerubbabel's coming in and saying he wants to lay claim to it because God said so. And he's opposing that. In fact, there is other opposition. There are grandchildren of the people who stayed there, who didn't have to go into exile. There are grandchildren, the people of Israel, still living there, who said, we'd like to help. And Zerubbabel goes, we don't want your help. And so even they were in opposition. It's so ironic that even the people of God were in opposition to the work of the rebuild. Doesn't that happen sometimes, even in faith? That people in the church, we often oppose each other. That's a whole different story. But the point is, we shouldn't stand in opposition to what God has for us to do. And he does. So he comes in, and there is a stoppage. They wouldn't let him continue. But thankfully, several years later, and in a stretch of about 20 years, this temple gets rebuilt. And under Zerubbabel's leadership, the temple gets rebuilt in Jerusalem. The building starts, the building stops, the building restarts. And this is the time when Haggai and Zechariah are prophesying that God has ordained this to happen. So when you see those books in the Bible, that's when this is taking place. When you read the books at the end of anyone know the last book of the Bible? The last book of the Old Testament as it's written in the Bible we have? Malachi. But you know that's not the last book of the Bible in the Old Testament? Did you know that? Okay. Because our Bible is not chronological. So right now, we're at the story in Zerubbabel where we are hearing from prophets like Haggai and Zechariah, and then soon after that is completed, that building's completed, the next story in the Bible is actually the story of Esther, and she becomes queen. And you know who was a prophet at that time? Malachi. So the last three books of the Bible in the Old Testament are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. All of those are happening right now. Right now. But do you know what the last real book chronologically is in the Old Testament? It's actually two books, but we've made it into two books, but it's actually one book. And it's the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. Chronologically, the last book of the Old Testament is Ezra and Nehemiah. So the story, which I'm looking at the clock, we're not even starting today, after all this groundwork, is the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, in the book of Ezra, that's where he recounts the story of Zerubbabel in the first few chapters. And then he recounts, and this is where it will end. I'll just tell you about Ezra today. Ezra goes back, and he's called because he's a scribe, he's a teacher, he's an expert in the Torah. He knows everything there is about the law. He loves it, and he loves to teach it. And the king at that time, and now putting that into time frame, several years later, this is like 458 BC, there's a Persian king, remember? Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian. The Persian king, Artaxerxes, is commissioning Ezra to go as this priest, scribe, writer, expert in the Torah, to return to establish something. He wants them to establish the spiritual and social renewal of the people, because the building of a building and the building of an altar were not enough. The people were still dispersed in the way that they live with one another. It's not just about a building. Any more that a church today being built makes a church. Ezra knew this too, and he went back to try and renew the people in their heart, to understand how to live together in community, to worship the one true God. He was there all about worship and word. And if you know our church, we have two pillars, worship and word. We believe in worship and word. And this is exactly what Ezra was trying to go and instill in the people of Judah, in Jerusalem. This recapturing, this rebuilding in the heart of what it means to worship and what it means to follow the word. That we could follow God in all of his ways, that we might receive the blessings of the covenants that were already proclaimed. And so Ezra comes, and he tries to do his best to work to make that social reform happen, but more importantly, the spiritual reform. And so all of that captured together, leading up to 444 BC, is when we meet a character by the name of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah's heart is broken. I'm going to leave you with this as a bit of a tease for next time. Okay? Nehemiah had a holy discontent. And I don't know if you've ever lived a life in your life and you said, there's just something in my spirit that's just not right with me or with the world. Well, for Nehemiah, there was a deep, holy discontent for him. And the deep discontent was that, yes, there was an altar. And yes, there was a temple. But the walls are still broken down. And it leaves people in fear. It leaves people unprotected. And so the 4 things I wrote down, if I can even find them, I don't even know now. I'll see if I can. If I can't, I'll try to remember them. I think I did. This is me writing all over my book. I'm sure I can remember it somehow. Let me see. Oh, there it is. Okay, so these are the 2 points, A and B in each. Nehemiah, and I preface this by saying that when we have a problem, we feel like we're at a low point, we have a holy discontent, something wrong with us, we want to know, how do we deal with it? In the same way that I was feeling weak, and so how do I deal with it? I just need to start doing something. Okay, so in his own heart, I want us to approach problems just like Nehemiah did, righteous, blameless, and faithful. He identified a problem. And then he initiated a prayer. And then he identified a person of influence. And then he initiated a plan. And I want to say for us that maybe this week, the homework is this, that we would identify a problem, something that we have in our heart that's really a holy discontent for us. That we wouldn't just point to, but the holy discontent is much more personal. It's the way God has wired you, and he said this is important for you to address. He wants you to pray. He wants you to initiate a prayer to him and say, what is it you would pray in response to that holy discontent? He wants to identify people in your life, whether it's him or others around us who are people of influence that can help make this change. And then he asks us to initiate a plan. He never asks us, when he puts a holy discontent on our heart, to stay still. There's something he's calling us to do. So with that introduction, I hope you come back next week and hear the story of Nehemiah. And I hope that's helped all of you not so historic people to understand the Bible just a little bit better. Father, I pray this morning that you are able to help us